a while back, I did a BBC about Rwanda, and the theme of that BBC was about rethinking things in the times that we live in. I think many people had a lot of thoughts that since so many things are changing, this is an opportune time to rethink how we're doing things. And there was this podcast I mentioned called Rethink out of Britain. And actually, the very first person on that podcast was Pope Francis. And I had heard him speak. I don't know much about Pope Francis, actually, but I heard him speak to our Congress, and some things he said that really stuck with me. And his podcast, which was very short, was interesting to me too. And so I went to the paper that was taken from. So last April 8th, he was asked by a writer in England who's published a few books about him, um, some questions that he about the pandemic and how to kind of be with it. And it started off with, you know, how is he kind of dealing with it practically and spiritually? And I found some of this very interesting. First, that they're sticking to the measures ordered by the authorities, by the health authorities, and that everyone here is working. There are no idlers here, meaning we can all kind of keep going, but we have to find ways to do things. But then on the spiritual side, it's more interesting. He says, how am I living this spiritually? And you have to remember, this is in Italy, and this is in the into the first week of April. He says, I'm praying more because I feel I should. And I think of people. That's what concerns me, people. Thinking of people anoints me. It does me good. It takes me out of my self-preoccupation. Of course, I have my areas of self-centeredness, of selfishness. On Tuesdays, my confessor comes and I take care of things there. And this is very much like our practice, but I didn't really know the Pope also had a confessor, because in the Catholic Church, at least when I read about St. Teresa, she had a confessor every month. You know, they conferred and she wrote to him, and that's what her diaries are from. But he has a confessor, and he's aware of his areas of selfishness, and he confesses them, just like we do with our self-centered thought and our purification practices. So that was really nice to hear about. And then he said, I'm thinking of my responsibilities now and what will come afterwards. And this is the theme of rethinking things. And so this is where it really interests me what he had to say, because there's many things you could say to how to rethink things. He says, what will be my service in the aftermath? That aftermath has already begun to be revealed as tragic and painful, which is why we must be thinking about it now. So he sees himself as living in a time of great uncertainty, which I think all of us here feel. Yesterday we were talking about this roller coaster of things in our political situation and many situations in this country, and it does feel like a roller coaster. So yes, a time of great uncertainty. And he says it's a time for inventing, for creativity. And that creativity is to show forth with new ways to do things, opening windows, opening, he says, transcendence towards God and towards people. So really opening ourselves to our spiritual practice. And he talked a lot about contemplation in this, trying to turn people away from zoning out on virtual media and to contemplate what's happening around them, the people around them, and really connect. And then the writer asked him, he had sent these questions to him, and he wrote the answers in Spanish, and the writer translated them. And basically, I reworded his question as, well, what do we do with all the roadblocks? It seems to me like I get optimistic about something, and then the next day it's just dashed. And this has been going like this for months now. You know, you just kind of think there's going to be some end in sight. But he took that even farther, and he talked about this poem by Virgil, Aeneid. It's an epic poem about what Aeneid did after the fall of Rome. So he really took this to an extreme of like, what comes to mind is a verse from Aeneid in the midst of defeat. He says, the counsel is not to give up, but to save yourself. And save yourself for better times. And then in those times, remember what has happened, because remembering what has happened will help us. So that was his main advice. Take care of yourself for a future time when there's nothing you can do now, and hold tight to, and don't forget things. Then the questioner asked him about, well, kind of like the theme of this rethinking things. Don't you see this as a time where there could be an ecological conversion or transformation, a time where we would reassess our priorities and our lifestyles, and especially in terms of economics, have a economics that's more based on human beings? And it's so interesting what he said to that question. He said, there's this expression in Spanish, God always forgives. We sometimes forgive, and nature never forgives. And then he went on to talk about all the things that we didn't respond to of the natural disasters that have happened that have humans are a part of. Many of the fires he spoke of in like Australia, and that boats are now able to cross over the North Pole, and all the things that he talked about were related to climate change, actually. And then he went on and said, we have a selective memory, and I want to dwell on this point. And this is, I think, the thing that I would like people to take from this talk, because I also have this thought that we've not been educated or educated ourselves or brought forward things from the past, and that's hurting us now, especially in terms of like how to deal with an epidemic or a pandemic. But what his mind went to was some of his own experiences. He talked about the 70th commemoration of Normandy, the landings in Normandy. And he said all these cultural and political people were there at the highest levels of culture and politics. It was one big celebration. And it's true that it marked the end of a dictatorship, but no one seemed to recall the 10,000 soldiers who died. And my uncle was there. My uncle was part of that, and he lived through that. But I never met him because he died in what was, as Pope Benedict said, senseless massacre. Because when Pope Francis went to another place, when there was the 100th anniversary of World War I, one place he went to, that's what came to his mind, Pope Benedict's words about just a senseless massacre. That was my uncle's situation. He died in Belgium in a situation that they classified for, I think, 50 years because it was so ill-planned, and it was like there was no way to win. It was a losing proposition, and all these people died, and it was horrible. And I never met him. That was, during World War II. So this is where his mind went. And then he went to speak a little bit about what's happening in Europe now with the populist speeches and how reminiscent it is of Hitler's speeches in 1933, and that many of the things that they're hearing now in Europe are very similar to what was being said back then. So this is why he's talking about this selective memory. We need to remember these things of the past. We need to not glorify war. We need to remember all the people who have been impacted by these things and what really happens. It's not a video game, And so, and my thought also, besides selective memory, was also selective attention, because this holiness talks about, to make good decisions, you have to look very broadly. You try to look at as many things as possible, because things are dependent arisings from many causes and conditions. And if your mind is narrow, if you only selectively attend to certain things, you'll see things in that way, and the decisions you make will not be good. And then, so he comes back to this thing about having we need to recover our memory because memory will come to our aid. This is not humanity's first plague. The others have become mere anecdotes. And so, and then he closed with something that I think is, I've found his writing really compelling, because I don't see him as necessarily worst case scenario, but I see his thinking as quite broad and deep, actually. And he says, every crisis contains both danger and opportunity. And the opportunity is to move out from the danger. And that's our opportunity now, is to not forget things from the past. Think broadly and, stay connected. Don't tune out on and the things that zone you out from what's happening, take care of ourselves so that we can meet the challenges that we face in these uncertain times.